The moment Marcus Ellison stepped onto North Star Flight 217, he sensed it, an undercurrent colder than the recycled air. The lead flight attendant, Victoria Hale, barely glanced at his boarding pass before her lips curved in a tight, dismissive smile. Every step to his seat felt heavier, every glance sharper. A man of his stature was used to silence, but this wasn't silence. This was judgment. He'd been underestimated before, but when the zip ties came out, biting into his wrists under the glare of dozens of passengers, Marcus knew this flight would land very differently than anyone expected. Marcus Ellison had learned to navigate hostel rooms without raising his voice. Boardrooms, courtrooms, and, occasionally, conference rooms filled with people who had underestimated him. But airports were supposed to be neutral territory, just gates, security lines, and the low hum of travelers passing through. Yet as he stepped into North Star's premium check-in counter, he felt the atmosphere tilt. Victoria Hale was there, poised behind the counter in her tailored Navy uniform. Her smile was the kind you could frame in an airline brochure, polished, professional, just enough warmth to seem genuine. But the way her eyes traveled over Marcus's tailored charcoal suit, then up to his face, had an edge to it. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, scanning his passport. "Flying with us in Business Elite today?" There was a faint stress on the word business, just enough to make it sound like a question, not a confirmation. Marcus gave her a single nod. "Yes," he replied evenly, placing his boarding pass on the counter. Her manicured fingers tapped on the keyboard a beat longer than necessary. "I see," she murmured, eyes flicking from the screen back to him. "I just need to run an additional verification. Routine, of course." He didn't respond. Routine. That word was a favorite shield for bias. He'd heard it before, in airports, in corporate circles, even in legal negotiations. It was almost never routine. Victoria typed a few more keys, her brows drawing together in exaggerated concentration. "Ah, here we are," she said at last, sliding his boarding pass back toward him. "Seat 2A. Enjoy your flight, Mr. Ellison." The pause before his name was slight, but it was there. Marcus took the pass, offered a faint smile, and walked toward the security line. He didn't look back, but he didn't need to. Years of experience had trained him to sense when eyes lingered too long. At the premium boarding gate, the agent scanned his pass. The beep was normal, but the agent's eyes flicked toward a small note on the screen. Marcus caught it in the reflection of the glass partition. "Extra ID check. Passenger risk." His jaw tightened slightly. He said nothing. Inside the jet bridge, the air was cooler, with that metallic tang of aluminum and fuel. The hum of the engines was distant, steady. He stepped into the cabin, the rich scent of leather and citrus polish greeting him like an old memory. Business Elite was arranged in a sleek 1-2-1 layout, wide seats facing forward with ample privacy. And there she was again, Victoria Hale, now in her role as lead flight attendant, standing at the threshold of the cabin. "Welcome aboard," she said brightly, the same rehearsed smile as before. Her eyes, however, were scanning him like a security camera. Marcus gave a polite nod and stepped past her. As he approached his seat, Victoria's voice carried just enough for the first few rows to hear. "Sir, I think there might be a mistake. Your boarding pass shows 2A. Are you sure this is correct?" Heads turned. A ripple of curiosity spread through the small cabin. Marcus stopped, met her gaze calmly. "That's the seat number on my ticket." Victoria tilted her head slightly, as though confused. "Of course. It's just unusual." There it was again, that calculated ambiguity. No outright accusation, just enough implication to suggest that perhaps he didn't belong. Marcus set his carry-on down in the overhead compartment without a word. He sat, adjusted his cuffs, and powered on his tablet, the glass screen casting a faint blue light over his composed expression. Victoria lingered a moment longer, her smile never wavering. Then she turned and walked back toward the galley, her heels clicking softly against the carpet. In the cockpit, The pre-flight checks continued. In the cabin, a few passengers glanced at Marcus, then quickly looked away. No one spoke, but the energy had shifted. A few minutes later, Victoria passed through again, this time holding a sleek crew tablet. As she approached Marcus's row, her finger slid casually across the screen. The reflection on the glossy surface revealed a drop-down menu, passenger notes. Her fingertip tapped once, twice. Flag. Passenger risk. Observation required. It was subtle, a keystroke hidden behind professional poise, but it wasn't meant for him to see. It was meant for the system. Marcus didn't move. He didn't react. But his mind recorded every detail, the timing, the gesture, the notation. The plane's door closed with a muted thud. Safety announcements rolled over the speakers, the voice cheerful and neutral. Victoria's smile returned as she moved through the cabin, but her attention kept drifting to the front display of her tablet. Marcus sat still, his seatbelt fastened, his hands resting lightly on his knees. To any casual observer, he was just another business traveler, calm and composed. But beneath that calm, his thoughts were already moving in calculated patterns. Victoria Hale had marked him before the plane even left the gate, and she'd done it in a way that would trigger a chain of protocols, subtle inconveniences, heightened scrutiny, all hidden behind layers of routine security. He'd been here before. Different city, different faces, same pattern. As the engines powered up and the aircraft began its slow taxi toward the runway, Marcus glanced once at the reflection in the polished window. His own eyes looked back at him, steady, unshaken. He'd been underestimated before, and every single time it had been a mistake. The cabin settled into its usual pre-takeoff rhythm. Passengers arranging their belongings, attendants completing safety checks, the low murmur of conversations blending with the hum of the engines. But there was an undercurrent Marcus could feel more than hear. From his seat in 2A, he could sense eyes glancing toward him, then away. A couple across the aisle spoke in hushed tones, their gazes darting toward his row. He kept his expression neutral, staring at the tablet in his lap, though he hadn't turned it on. Victoria Hale moved through the aisle with the grace of practiced authority. Her professional smile was flawless, but there was something calculated in how she engaged each passenger, except Marcus. At 1C, she poured champagne with a charming laugh. At 1A, she knelt slightly to adjust a blanket, her voice warm and attentive. At 2A, she didn't even look his way. The cart rolled past without a pause, the clink of glassware and the fizz of poured drinks trailing behind. Marcus didn't shift, didn't speak. He had no intention of asking for what should have been offered freely. Jake Larson, the junior flight attendant, followed behind Victoria, carrying a tray of sparkling water and packaged snacks. His steps slowed as he reached Marcus's row. There was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, a subtle tightening in his jaw. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but Victoria's voice called sharply from the galley. "Jake, let's keep moving. First service needs to stay on schedule." Jake's mouth closed. He gave Marcus an almost apologetic glance, then moved on. Marcus kept his gaze forward. The engines roared as the plane lifted off, the ground dropping away in a blur of runway lights and shadow. The cabin tilted briefly, then leveled into the smooth hum of cruising altitude. Victoria's service began in earnest. Champagne flowed, menus were handed out, conversations deepened. And still, 2A was treated as if it were an empty seat. It wasn't the first time Marcus had been invisible by design. The silence was a tactic, a calculated denial of acknowledgement meant to erode dignity. But he wasn't here for dignity. He was here for observation. From 3 rows back, a soft electronic chime broke the rhythm. A woman in her early 30s, seated in 5C, angled her phone discreetly, the front-facing camera capturing her whispered commentary. "Look at this," she murmured to her followers. "Business elite, and they're acting like this man doesn't even exist. No drink service, no menu, no greeting. I don't care what anyone says. This is targeted." Her voice was calm but firm, her expression a mix of disbelief and indignation. Marcus didn't turn, but he caught the reflection of her phone in the polished trim of the cabin window. She was streaming live. Victoria was 2 rows ahead, laughing with another passenger. If she'd heard the commentary, she gave no sign. Within minutes, the chat on the woman's screen began to scroll rapidly. Messages of support, outrage, and disbelief filled the feed. "This is unacceptable. Name the airline. Tag them. Stay live. We're sharing this." For a brief moment, Marcus could feel the subtle shift in the cabin's energy. Passengers sat a little straighter, glancing toward him, toward Victoria. The live stream was a window, and the outside world was watching. Then, as quietly as it began, the energy changed again. The woman's phone vibrated. She frowned, glanced down at the screen, and her brows furrowed. "What?" she whispered. Her feed abruptly froze. The scrolling comments stopped mid-sentence. A red error banner appeared across the screen. "Stream ended. Terms of service violation." Confused murmurs rippled from the few passengers who'd noticed. The woman tried refreshing the app, then switching to another, but her connection dropped to a loading circle that never completed. Within 10 minutes, the video was gone. Not just offline, deleted. She stared at her screen in disbelief. "It's just gone," she murmured to the man next to her. Marcus caught the words, though he still hadn't turned. His expression remained impassive, but the implications were clear. Whatever force was working against him wasn't confined to the cabin. Victoria passed by again, her tablet in hand. Her smile hadn't changed, but the faint upward curve at the corner of her mouth carried a shadow of triumph. Jake followed behind, quieter this time. His eyes darted toward Marcus again, but he kept moving. Ryan Cole, seated in the jump seat near the rear, had noticed the unusual dynamic. He wasn't a regular flight attendant. He was on board for a systems inspection. His job was technical, not passenger-facing, but he'd flown enough times to recognize when procedure felt off. Victoria's meticulous avoidance of 2A was beyond unprofessional. It was strategic. The live stream incident only deepened his concern. A passenger trying to document the treatment of another had her feed cut midstream. That wasn't standard airline policy. Ryan quietly opened the cabin systems panel on his crew tablet, pretending to review environmental controls. Instead, he pulled up network diagnostics. The logs showed a priority override initiated from the lead attendant's device, Victoria's device. Marcus sat silently, but Ryan had a feeling that silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. The rest of the cabin buzzed softly with conversation. Glasses clinked, silverware chimed against porcelain. But around 2A, there was a pocket of quiet, a subtle isolation. It was deliberate. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his fingers lightly resting on the armrest. His breathing was steady, his posture calm. He had no intention of playing into whatever narrative Victoria was building. The live stream was gone. The outside world wouldn't see this. Not yet. But Marcus wasn't relying on the outside world. The hum of the engines had settled into a steady rhythm, the kind of background noise most passengers tuned out within minutes. But for Marcus Ellison, the hum was the only constant in a cabin where everything else was shifting. Victoria Hale moved with a poise that could fool anyone who wasn't paying attention. Her smile remained flawless, her steps measured, her tone polished. But her eyes, those gave her away. She stopped at 1C, laughing softly with a businessman in a pinstripe suit. She adjusted the man's glass, complimented his choice of wine, and moved on. Then she reached 2A. Her smile didn't falter, but it changed, became colder, thinner. She leaned in just slightly, her voice dropping to a low, clinical register. "Mr. Ellison," she said, "I'm going to need you to place your hands on the armrest." The request was abrupt, the tone sharp enough to cut through the hum of the cabin. Conversations nearby faltered. Marcus turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze with the same measured calm he'd maintained since boarding. "Excuse me?" Victoria's professional veneer held firm. "This is a standard safety protocol for high-risk passengers. We've received a directive. Please place your hands where I can see them." High-risk passenger. The words were carefully chosen, just vague enough to avoid a direct accusation, but heavy enough to make nearby ears prick with suspicion. A murmur passed through the cabin. Heads turned. A man in 2B shifted uncomfortably, his phone angling subtly to record. Marcus didn't move. "I wasn't aware there was an issue," he said evenly. Victoria's smile thinned further. "Sir, I'm following security procedure. If you'd prefer to discuss it after landing, that can be arranged. But for now, your compliance is necessary." She reached into the side pocket of her apron and pulled out a pair of industrial zip ties, their plastic edges catching the overhead light. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. The man in 2B wasn't the only one recording now. A couple in 3A had stopped their conversation mid-sentence, their eyes locked on the scene. Victoria stepped closer. "Hands, please." Marcus looked at the zip ties, then at her. His expression didn't change. His eyes were cold, steady. "Of course," he said, his voice calm. He extended his wrists forward, resting them lightly on the armrests. Victoria looped the first tie around his right wrist, pulling it snug. The plastic ratcheted tight with a series of sharp clicks. The second followed, binding his left wrist to the opposite armrest. The motion was swift, practiced. The sight of the CEO of Orion Shield, a man worth billions, restrained like a disruptive passenger in the middle of a premium cabin. It was the kind of image that burned itself into memory. Gasps rippled through the rows. A child in 4C whispered loudly to his mother, "Why are they tying him up?" The mother shushed him quickly, her eyes darting nervously toward Victoria. Jake Larson appeared at the far end of the aisle, his expression tight. His gaze flicked from Victoria to Marcus, then back again. He opened his mouth to speak, but Victoria cut him off with a sharp glance. "Jake," she said smoothly, "please secure the galley." Jake hesitated, then nodded stiffly and disappeared behind the curtain. Marcus sat still, his breathing steady. The plastic dug into his skin, but he didn't flinch. "May I ask what the official reason is for this restraint?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying just enough for the nearest passengers to hear. Victoria didn't answer directly. "Security concerns, Mr. Ellison," she replied, her tone crisp. "That's not an answer," he said evenly. "It's the only one you're getting at the moment," she said, turning away. The cabin felt smaller now, the air heavier. Passengers shifted in their seats, their conversations reduced to whispers. Phones were lowered discreetly, recordings continuing from safer angles. A man in 5D leaned toward his companion. "They can't just tie someone up without cause." His companion shook his head. "You'd be surprised what they can do midair." Victoria disappeared into the galley, her voice low as she spoke into her crew radio. The words were indistinct, but her posture was tense, her shoulders squared. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, the hum of the engines filling the silence around him. His wrists ached, the plastic biting deeper with every small shift of the plane. But his mind was elsewhere, cataloging every detail, every look, every word. He'd been in tighter positions before. From the rear, Ryan Cole watched the scene unfold. His role as a systems technician didn't usually involve passenger interactions, but this wasn't a typical flight. He'd seen zip ties used before, rarely, and only when a passenger posed a physical threat. But Marcus Ellison had been silent, composed, controlled. Ryan's gut told him this wasn't about passenger safety. In the cabin, tension built like static before a storm. Passengers waited. A few exchanged glances, expecting something, someone, to intervene. Surely, they thought, an incident like this would trigger some response. Airline security, federal marshals, someone. But no one came. Minutes passed. The engines droned on. The seatbelt sign remained lit. The cabin crew moved with forced normalcy, avoiding prolonged glances at 2A. Victoria re-emerged, her expression composed once more. She checked the curtain separating business elite from first, adjusted a tray of glasses, and walked past Marcus without a word. The man in 2B lowered his phone slightly. "Isn't someone going to do something?" he muttered under his breath. No one answered. The absence of intervention was louder than any announcement could have been. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, testing the restraint. The ties held firm. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that marked the moment before a strategy changed direction. If the plan had been to provoke him, it wasn't going to work. He kept his posture calm, his eyes forward. But the cabin felt tighter now, the walls closer, the air thinner. The passengers who had expected drama to resolve quickly, perhaps even dramatically, with law enforcement waiting at the next stop, were beginning to realize this wasn't that kind of story. This was slower, colder, and it was far from over. Somewhere near the back, Jake Larson reappeared, moving quietly. He avoided Marcus's gaze, avoided Victoria's too. His hand brushed the side of the galley as he passed, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm. Ryan noticed. Victoria's voice came over the intercom, calm and neutral. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are continuing our flight as scheduled. Thank you for your cooperation." Her tone was steady, but there was a sharpness underneath it, a tension that betrayed the smooth surface. Marcus glanced at the reflection in the window once more. His own eyes looked back at him, cold, steady, unbroken. He'd been restrained before. Not like this, but enough to know that restraint was only part of the game. The cabin settled into a tense quiet again, the kind of silence that doesn't relax. It waits, and Marcus waited with it. The zip ties dug into Marcus's wrists, but pain was secondary. He focused on the rhythm of his breathing, keeping his body perfectly still. Outwardly, he was a man in quiet submission. Inwardly, gears turned with precision. Beneath the cuff of his tailored shirt, a small movement triggered the faintest vibration, a sequence only he could feel. It wasn't random. 2 short pulses, a pause, then one long. It was the signal that activated the embedded transmitter in his watch. The device was designed to be invisible to standard scans, masked under the guise of a luxury timepiece. But its true purpose wasn't to tell time. It was to connect him to Ethan Ward. Hundreds of miles away, in a sleek glass office overlooking Harbor City's skyline, Ethan Ward's phone vibrated against the surface of his desk. He had been reviewing case briefs, half listening to a conference call, when the alert came through. His gaze dropped to the screen. The message was simple. Ellison protocol, level red. Ethan's jaw tightened. He stood, sliding his phone into his inner pocket, and reached for the secure briefcase beside his chair. "Cancel the rest of my day," he told his assistant, his voice flat. "But sir..." "Now." Within seconds, Ethan was out the door, his pace measured but urgent. Back aboard North Star Flight 217, Marcus sat perfectly still, the cabin a muted theater of false calm. 3 rows back, Ryan Cole had been tracking the strange tension all flight. His job as a systems inspector for North Star rarely intersected with passenger matters, but everything about this flight had set off alarms in his head. Victoria's treatment of 2A, the unexplained passenger risk flag, the deleted live stream, and now the restraint, executed without the slightest provocation. Ryan opened his crew tablet under the pretense of checking environmental controls. His fingers navigated away from cabin pressure readings to the maintenance network. He selected Operations Diagnostics and initiated a silent report. The data packets began transmitting, compressed logs of crew actions, network overrides, and internal communications flagged for unusual patterns. His report was routed to the airline's Central Operations Hub as standard protocol. But then, something strange happened. The transmission stalled. Ryan frowned, his eyes narrowing at the sudden transmission pending notification. A second later, the status changed. Connection interrupted. He tried again, rerouting through a secondary channel. The result was the same. The interruption wasn't random. Ryan's mind raced. For a transmission to be blocked at this level, it had to be intercepted from the ground, or by someone with administrative clearance on the plane. He glanced toward the front of the cabin. Victoria stood near the galley, her back to the passengers, her tablet in hand. Her posture was casual, but her shoulders were stiff, every movement precise. Ryan minimized his screen quickly, masking the interruption with a fake oxygen tank diagnostics display in case anyone looked over. If she had access to override transmissions, that meant someone was feeding her instructions directly. Meanwhile, Ethan Ward's sedan cut through midday traffic, sirens wailing faintly in the distance from some unrelated call. He wasn't driving. A trusted Orion Shield security driver was at the wheel, weaving through lanes with a precision that came from years of experience. Ethan was on a secure call, voice low and clipped. Flight 27, Business Elite Cabin. Passenger risk flag is bogus. Marcus has been restrained midair. On the other end, a federal contact's tone hardened. That shouldn't even be possible without multiple authorizations. You're saying Hale initiated this solo? Ethan's voice dropped lower. Hale's not solo. My guess is she's acting on a directive from higher up. I want to know who. Back on the plane, Marcus tested the flex of the zip ties against the armrests. They were industrial grade, meant to hold, not to give. That was fine. Restraints didn't matter when the real moves were happening elsewhere. Ryan moved quietly down the aisle, checking overhead bins as a pretense to get closer to Marcus's row. Victoria turned sharply. Everything secure back there, Ryan? Yes, ma'am, Ryan said smoothly, forcing his face into a neutral expression. Her eyes lingered on him for a fraction too long before she turned back toward the galley. Ryan didn't miss the way her hand hovered over her tablet. Marcus's gaze flicked briefly toward Ryan as the younger man passed by. It was only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. A silent recognition. Ryan returned to his jump seat, mind racing. His report hadn't gone through. His usual channels were blocked, and the only person on board with the access to do that was the same person targeting Marcus. Victoria Hale. Ethan's car pulled up to a secure building near the Federal Aviation Authority's regional office. He stepped out, his briefcase in one hand, phone in the other. His secure line buzzed again. "Ward!" came the voice of Agent Mason Reed, sharp and direct. "I heard about your man on 217. What's the play?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "Get your people ready. If this goes the way I think it will, you'll need boots on the ground when that plane lands." "Landing where?" Reed asked. "That," Ethan said grimly, "is the question." On board, Ryan opened a discreet diagnostic panel on his tablet. The cabin network log showed an unusual reroute. Victoria's tablet had initiated a persistent background connection to an external operations address. It wasn't just crew chat. It was live communication with someone off the aircraft. Marcus sat in silence, but his mind registered the shift in energy around him. The tension wasn't just between him and Hale anymore. It had spread. Passengers were quieter now. The whispers had taken on a new tone. Not just curiosity, but unease. In 5C, the woman who had tried to live stream earlier sat with her phone in her lap, scrolling aimlessly. She'd stopped trying to record, but her eyes kept drifting toward Marcus's row. At the front, Victoria's professional mask didn't slip, but Ryan noticed her checking the flight time more often. It was as though she were counting down. He closed his tablet, the failure of his transmission weighing heavily. If the ground crew was in on this, there was no telling how deep the interference went. Marcus shifted slightly, the faint hum of his watch sending another pulse outward. He didn't expect an immediate rescue. He expected readiness. Victoria stepped into the aisle again, glancing briefly at Marcus before addressing the passengers with another perfectly crafted smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be offering a light refreshment shortly. Please remain seated and comfortable." Her voice was calm, even pleasant, but Ryan caught the faint glint of satisfaction in her eyes when they passed over 2A. In Ethan's world, that expression meant one thing. Someone thought they were in control. But Marcus Ellison had built his career proving people wrong about that. Ethan Ward strode into the secure wing of the FAA regional office, his ID badge flashing under the scanner as the steel doors slid open. His expression was as controlled as ever, but beneath that calm exterior was the sharp, calculating urgency of a man who knew time was bleeding away at 30,000 feet. A secure conference room waited for him. A long table, dim lighting, and a wall of encrypted monitors that blinked with streams of data. A federal liaison, lean, mid-40s, eyes permanently narrowed from too many crises, was already inside. "Ward," the liaison said, gesturing toward the terminal. "We pulled your alert. What's the situation?" Ethan slid his briefcase onto the table, unclasped it, and placed Marcus's encrypted watch reader in front of him. "Marcus Ellison is restrained midair on Flight 217. Passenger risk flag was fabricated. I want this on your radar now." The liaison tapped into the FAA system. His brows furrowed almost immediately. "That's strange." Ethan's voice stayed cool. "What's strange?" The liaison turned the monitor toward him. On the screen, Marcus's passenger profile was highlighted in yellow, with a bright red banner across the top. "Under investigation. Clearance restricted." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's not possible. Marcus hasn't had an active federal inquiry in years. Who put this here?" "That's the thing," the liaison said, scrolling. "There's no origin log. It's as if the flag was inserted manually into the live system, off record." The room went still for a moment. Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You're telling me my client has been marked as an active investigation target mid-flight, with no paper trail?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," the liaison replied grimly. "For the average passenger, a flag like that would mean nothing more than some added scrutiny at landing. For Marcus Ellison, on this flight, with these circumstances, it was the perfect cover for something much darker." Ethan reached for the watch reader, sliding it closer. He unlocked the security latch and pressed the recessed button on the side. The reader pulsed once, then synced to Marcus's signal. The device decrypted the hidden data stream stored in the watch's secure core. Streams of log files began scrolling across the monitor, timestamps, access attempts, and, most importantly, packets of raw network data. Ethan's eyes scanned the feed. "There it is. What am I looking at?" the liaison asked, leaning closer. "Not passenger data," Ethan said quietly. "Passenger surveillance." The liaison frowned. "Surveillance? You mean standard Wi-Fi activity logs?" Ethan shook his head. "No. I mean embedded modules piggybacking on in-flight Wi-Fi to capture device data, contacts, messages, even encrypted transfers. And it's not passive collection. This is targeted harvesting." The liaison's expression hardened. "That's illegal at every level." Ethan's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Which is why someone flagged Marcus. He's the one man on that plane capable of proving it exists." Back aboard Flight 217, Marcus remained still in 2A. Victoria passed by again, her polished smile intact, her attention seemingly focused on other passengers. But Marcus could see the subtle check of her watch, the faint glance toward the cockpit. Ryan Cole sat in the jump seat near the back, scrolling through blocked transmission logs on his tablet. He had tried 3 times to send an anomaly report, each one intercepted. Now, watching Victoria's every movement, he was certain there was interference from inside the airline. In the FAA conference room, Ethan typed rapidly, isolating one of the modules from Marcus's decrypted logs. The data structure was sophisticated but familiar. North Star's in-flight entertainment system was just a shell. Underneath was a secondary executable file, one that had no business being there. The liaison scrolled further, his voice tight. "You're telling me they've been doing this on how many flights?" Ethan tapped a key, bringing up the compiled list. "According to the timestamps, thousands. And these aren't random routes. These are high-profile lanes, corporate corridors, political events, international summits." The liaison stared at the list. That's not a breach. That's espionage. Ethan nodded. And if Marcus's watch can get us this data, imagine what he has in his servers at Orion Shield. The liaison stepped back, exhaling sharply. This goes above my clearance. Ethan leaned forward, voice steady. Then raise your clearance, because right now there's a man on that plane who's being set up as a scapegoat. And the only thing keeping this from becoming an unfortunate incident is the fact that he planned for this. The liaison hesitated only a second before picking up the phone. Get me Reed, he said sharply. In another part of the building, Agent Mason Reed's secure line buzzed. He was already in motion, dark suit, badge clipped to his belt, walking toward the readiness bay where a tactical team prepped for rapid deployment. Reed answered. Ward? Ethan's voice was low, precise. We've got proof. North Star's been harvesting passenger data. Marcus has the logs. They're embedded in his watch. I need you in position when that plane touches ground. Reed's tone didn't shift, but the air around him did. Understood. I'll have my team at the primary gate, but if they divert, they'll try. Ethan cut in. Be ready at both. Back on Flight 217, the tension in the cabin was almost tangible. Marcus shifted his wrists slightly against the plastic, feeling the faint indentation where the watch pressed against his skin. He didn't know the exact status of Ethan's work, but he trusted the man's precision. Victoria moved toward the cockpit again, her expression unreadable. Passengers were watching now, not just out of curiosity, but with growing unease. A few phones were still recording, but more subtly than before. Ryan adjusted his tablet, opening a hidden diagnostic port. He couldn't transmit out, but he could log everything. If they landed without outside contact, this log might be the only proof of what had happened in flight. Ethan's fingers flew across the keys, isolating the final packet from the watch's memory. The liaison leaned closer, scanning the metadata. Where does this go? He asked. Ethan's answer was cold. A North Star-controlled server, but not domestic. The endpoint is bouncing through 2 overseas proxies. Whoever's running this knows what they're doing. The liaison exhaled. And if this goes public? Ethan looked up, his expression unreadable. If this goes public, North Star collapses before the market closes. In the sky, Marcus glanced at the reflection in the window. The horizon was still hours away, but the path was already shifting. This wasn't a game of survival anymore. It was a game of timing, and timing was something Marcus Ellison understood better than most. The cabin had taken on a fragile stillness, the kind that teetered between tense quiet and inevitable disruption. Marcus Ellison sat in 2A, his posture calm but deliberate, wrists bound to the armrests by zip ties that dug a little deeper with every subtle movement of the plane. Victoria Hale had disappeared briefly into the galley. For the first time in nearly an hour, there was no immediate pressure, just the hum of the engines, the faint clink of glasses from another section, and the weight of watchful eyes. Then, Jake Larson appeared. The younger flight attendant's steps were slow, hesitant. His hands were clasped in front of him, fingers tapping nervously against one another. He glanced toward the galley, then toward the cockpit, before finally letting his gaze settle on Marcus. Jake approached the aisle seat cautiously, his voice low enough that only Marcus could hear. Mr. Ellison. His tone was almost apologetic. Marcus looked at him, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp enough to pin Jake in place. Yes? Jake shifted on his feet, his voice dropping lower. I know this isn't right. For a brief moment, the tension in the cabin shifted. A few passengers noticed the 2 men speaking quietly and exchanged hopeful glances. Ryan Cole, seated in the jump seat further back, tilted his head just slightly, trying to catch the exchange. Jake leaned in closer, his voice a whisper. I want to help you, but you have to stay quiet. Please. Marcus's gaze didn't waver. Helping me would start with cutting these off, he said, flexing his wrists slightly against the ties. Jake's hand twitched toward the pocket where his safety shears usually were. His eyes darted toward the galley again, then back at Marcus. For a moment, it looked as if he might actually do it. Passengers in the nearby rows leaned forward ever so slightly, sensing a shift. It was subtle, but the air in the cabin seemed to lift. This could be the turn they'd been waiting for. Jake's fingers brushed the edge of the zip tie. His breath was shallow, uneven. Then he whispered, barely audible, "I'm sorry." Before Marcus could reply, Jake's hand snapped forward, not to cut, but to pull. The plastic tightened sharply, digging deeper into Marcus's skin with a harsh, biting sound. Marcus's jaw tightened, but his expression didn't crack. Gasps came from the nearby seats. The man in 2B lowered his phone for a moment, his recording still rolling. A woman in 3A muttered under her breath, "What is he doing?" Jake stepped back quickly, his face pale. His voice was tense, almost shaking. "It's for your safety," he said louder now, so nearby passengers could hear the lie. "Standard procedure." Marcus's eyes locked on Jake's. "Whose safety?" he asked quietly. Jake didn't answer. He stepped back again, glancing toward the galley. Victoria emerged just then, her smile as sharp as glass. "Everything under control here, Jake?" she asked, her voice warm but laced with steel. Jake's Adam's apple bobbed. "Yes, ma'am. Just securing the passenger." Victoria's eyes drifted to Marcus, then back to Jake. "Good," she said smoothly, before walking past them toward the cockpit. Ryan watched the exchange, his gut twisting. He'd seen Jake hesitate before, had even thought the younger attendant might be an ally. But this, the tightening of the restraints, wasn't the action of someone working against Victoria. Unless, Ryan thought grimly, Jake was being forced. Back in 2A, Marcus's wrists throbbed where the zip ties had cut deeper into his skin. The pain wasn't the problem. Pain was just a signal. What mattered was what Jake had just revealed. His fear. It wasn't loyalty to Victoria that made Jake act. It was self-preservation. From the rear of the cabin, Ryan noticed something else. When Jake stepped away from Marcus, he lingered briefly by the service panel, his hand brushing the edge of a small crewcom device clipped to his waistband. His thumb tapped it twice, deliberately, almost mechanically, before he walked away. Ryan's instincts prickled. That wasn't standard. Up front, Victoria spoke in hushed tones to the captain, her body angled to block the view from passengers. The cockpit door remained closed, but her posture was tense. Jake disappeared into the galley again. When he re-emerged, his face was drawn, pale. He avoided Marcus's eyes entirely as he moved down the aisle. The passengers, who had felt a flicker of hope moments earlier, now sat in uneasy silence. The betrayal was complete, not because Marcus had been abandoned, but because the illusion of a savior had been shattered. Marcus leaned back slightly, adjusting his shoulders against the seat. His breathing was even, his eyes scanning the cabin once more. In moments like these, he didn't waste energy on anger. Anger was loud. Anger was messy. And Marcus Ellison had built his empire on being silent when others screamed. Ryan shifted in his seat again, glancing at his blocked tablet. His transmission was still jammed. Every route he tried was intercepted. The interference wasn't a fluke, it was calculated. He made a note of Jake's behavior, logging the movement toward the comm device. There was a pattern forming here, and Ryan was starting to see its outline. In the galley, Victoria's voice drifted softly into the cabin. "Approach holding standard vector." The words were meant for the cockpit, but Ryan caught them. His training told him what they meant. The flight path was being adjusted. Marcus caught Ryan's eyes for the briefest second. The exchange was wordless, but the message was clear. Stay alert. Jake passed by Marcus again on his way to the rear. For a moment, he hesitated, glancing down at Marcus's bound wrists. His lips pressed into a tight line, but he said nothing. Marcus's voice was low, controlled. "You had your chance," he said quietly. Jake didn't respond. He walked on, his steps heavier than before. Victoria returned to the aisle, her smile perfectly in place once more. To the passengers, she was the picture of composure. To Marcus, she was the center of a carefully orchestrated operation. The cabin settled again into its uneasy rhythm, but the damage was done. The passengers who had hoped for resolution now carried the weight of disappointment. The betrayal had sunk the mood lower than silence ever could, and Marcus, bound and silent, knew that was exactly the point. The tension in the cabin was no longer a quiet undercurrent. It had weight, pressing down on every row. The passengers sensed it even if they couldn't name it. The polite professionalism of a premium flight had thinned into something taut and brittle, ready to snap at the smallest shift. In the jump seat at the rear of Business Elite, Ryan Cole kept his expression neutral as his fingers slid across the maintenance tablet resting on his lap. To anyone glancing his way, he was checking routine system diagnostics. In reality, he was diving deeper into layers of the cabin network few people outside operations even knew existed. The blocked transmissions earlier had been strange enough, but the way Jake had tightened Marcus Ellison's restraints and the subtle urgency in Victoria Hale's exchanges with the cockpit told Ryan there was something else in play. He navigated past the standard environmental controls and passenger service logs, bypassing the thin wall of encryption into the navigation status feed. His eyes scanned the data. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Flight 277's heading, altitude, and destination matched the manifest. Valenport International, on schedule. But Ryan's instincts told him to dig deeper. He accessed the restricted channel reserved for crew-level adjustments. The code wasn't encrypted as heavily here, just hidden behind layers of innocuous logs. And then he saw it. Waypoint alteration, pending. The notation was subtle, buried within a string of automated updates. But Ryan recognized the pattern. It wasn't just turbulence avoidance or air traffic spacing. The coordinates had been changed, nudged by a few degrees, then locked in. A new arrival airport was listed. Not Valenport. Hollow Creek Airfield. Ryan's breath tightened in his chest. Hollow Creek wasn't a standard diversion site. It was a small facility, technically certified for emergency landings, but almost never used for commercial flights. The kind of place where a plane could land quietly, without attracting much attention. He glanced up toward the cockpit door. Victoria was just stepping away from it, her tablet in hand. Her face was composed, but there was the faintest glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. Ryan's suspicion hardened. He minimized the navigation screen quickly, switching to a different set of logs. He traced the diversion order back to its origin. It hadn't come from ground control. It had been authorized from the cockpit. The captain himself had executed the change. Ryan's stomach tightened. It wasn't unusual for pilots to adjust course with clearance, but diversions like this were always logged with multiple acknowledgements. This one wasn't. He dug deeper into the transaction history. That's when he saw it. Buried in the crew system ledger was a non-standard entry. Incentive credit received. The captain's name was tagged beside it. Ryan sat back in his seat for a moment, his mind racing. This wasn't just Victoria Hale acting alone. The captain was involved. The diversion wasn't an operational decision. It was a handoff. In 2A, Marcus Ellison sat perfectly still, but his eyes tracked every movement in the cabin. He noticed Ryan's glance toward the cockpit, the brief tightening of his expression. Victoria strolled back down the aisle, pausing to exchange a pleasantry with a passenger in 3A. To anyone watching casually, she looked every inch the professional attendant. But Ryan knew better. He had worked enough flights to know when the service was just window dressing. As Victoria passed Ryan's jump seat, her eyes flicked toward his tablet for just a fraction of a second. Ryan's fingers stilled on the screen, his body language casual. "Everything in order back here, Cole?" she asked smoothly. "Yes, ma'am," Ryan replied, his tone steady. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Good." She walked on, but Ryan could feel her attention linger even as her back turned. He reopened the navigation feed, this time taking a screenshot of the diversion order and the incentive log attached to the captain's ID. He encrypted it, burying it in a maintenance diagnostic file that looked like a routine system check. If his tablet was scanned, it would just look like standard procedure. In the cabin, the passengers were starting to sense the tension again. Conversations faltered as eyes tracked Victoria's movements. A man in 5B leaned to his seatmate. "Why are we descending so soon?" His seatmate glanced at the flight map on the seatback screen, frowning. "That doesn't look like Valenport." Up front, the intercom clicked on. The captain's voice was calm, practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're making a minor adjustment to our approach due to air traffic. We'll have you on the ground shortly. Thank you for your understanding." Ryan's jaw tightened. It was a clean explanation. Just enough detail to quiet suspicion, not enough to invite questions. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, as though settling himself. The hum of the engines shifted slightly as the plane began its descent. Ryan knew he had limited time. He initiated a secondary log transmission, not through the blocked network, but through a hidden maintenance relay. It wouldn't reach the FAA directly, but it would ping the Orion Shield endpoint embedded in Marcus's watch. Victoria passed by again, her smile still in place. But when her eyes met Marcus's, there was a flicker, something between triumph and warning. Marcus didn't respond. His wrists remained bound, his posture unbroken. Ryan's transmission sent. He locked the tablet, tucking it under his arm as he stood to check a storage compartment. His movement was casual, but his pulse raced. He had proof now. Proof that this wasn't just a rogue attendant. The captain was complicit, and if the captain was in, then whatever waited at Hollow Creek Airfield wasn't going to be standard procedure. In 2A, Marcus opened his eyes again, catching Ryan's movement. There was a brief exchange of understanding in that glance. This was bigger than they had thought. And it wasn't over. The descent was gradual, but the unease in the cabin was anything but. The overhead lights dimmed slightly as the engines throttled back, the subtle cues of a landing sequence. Yet the passengers knew something was off. The flight map on the seatback screens didn't match the familiar approach to Valenport International. In 2A, Marcus Ellison sat still, his wrists still bound by the zip ties that bit into his skin. His expression was calm, but his eyes were locked on the small changes happening around him. Victoria Hale walking the aisle with rehearsed serenity, Jake Larson's nervous pacing, and the cockpit door that seemed to open just a fraction too often. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, smooth and confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly at an alternate airport due to traffic congestion at Valenport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Alternate airport." The words were delivered casually, but Marcus recognized the careful construction of the lie. In the jump seat, Ryan Cole closed his tablet. His hidden transmission to Marcus's watch had been sent. Now, it was just a matter of whether the right people would be in place when they landed. On the ground, the tarmac at Hollow Creek Airfield was quiet under a pale afternoon sky. There was no usual bustle of ground crews and luggage carts. Instead, two unmarked SUVs idled discreetly near the far end of the runway. A nondescript black van was parked closer to the gate, its side door slightly ajar. But there was something else. Inside the jetway attached to the arrival gate, Agent Mason Reed stood with 3 members of his tactical team. They wore plain clothes, but their posture was unmistakable, alert, ready. Reed's expression was all business as he checked his earpiece. "Confirm," he said into the mic. "Flight 217 on approach. Jetway locked." "Confirmed," came the voice in his ear. Back on the aircraft, the wheels dropped with a mechanical thud. The cabin trembled slightly, passengers sitting a little straighter as the reality of the descent set in. Victoria passed Marcus's row, her professional smile unbroken, but there was a slight tension in her jaw now. Jake followed a few paces behind, avoiding Marcus's gaze entirely. His eyes flicked toward the cockpit, then back down the aisle, as though waiting for a signal that never came. The runway rose to meet the plane. Tires screeched against asphalt, and the engines roared in reverse thrust. The aircraft slowed, then turned sharply off the main runway toward a secluded taxiway. Reed's earpiece buzzed. "They're pulling into Gate 3. "Positions," Reed ordered. The plane rolled to a stop. Inside the cabin, the seatbelt sign chimed off, but Victoria stepped into the aisle immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated while we await clearance to disembark," she said smoothly, her voice carrying just enough authority to sound routine. At the forward door, the latch disengaged with a metallic click. The jetway connected. The seal hissed into place. Then it happened. The door swung open, and Mason Reed stepped inside, his presence cutting through the cabin like a blade. His dark blazer framed the badge clipped at his hip, but it was the authority in his eyes that froze the aisle. "Victoria Hale," he said, his voice sharp, unflinching. Victoria's face lost a fraction of its composure. "Agent Reed," she began, her tone attempting calm. "Step forward," Reed ordered. Jake froze mid-step, his face paling. Passengers leaned into the aisles, their eyes wide. "This is a misunderstanding," Victoria tried again, her voice firm but lacking the confidence she'd shown all flight. "Step forward." Her hesitation lasted only a second before two members of Reed's team stepped inside, moving with quiet precision. They took position on either side of her. Reed stepped closer, producing a warrant folder and holding it at chest level. "Victoria Hale, you're being taken into federal custody on charges of unlawful restraint, interference with a protected individual, and conspiracy to commit data espionage." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Phones came up discreetly, recording what they could. Jake stepped back involuntarily. His eyes darted from Victoria to Reed, then to Marcus. Victoria turned toward Jake, her voice sharp now, all traces of professionalism stripped away. "Don't say a word." Reed's attention shifted briefly to the cockpit. "Captain Harris," his voice carried, firm and clear. The cockpit door opened slowly. The captain stepped out, his expression carefully neutral. "Agent Reed," he said, almost too smoothly. "Step forward," Reed said again. "I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for—" Reed cut him off. "You authorized a diversion to Hollow Creek without proper clearance. You executed a non-standard incentive transaction logged under your ID. You're coming with us." The captain's composure faltered for just a moment. "That's classified operational procedure," Reed signaled to his team. Two agents stepped forward, positioning themselves on either side of the captain. Passengers looked on, wide-eyed. The murmurs grew louder. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a single rogue attendant. Victoria's jaw tightened as she was led toward the door, her polished exterior gone. The captain followed, his expression grim. In 2A, Marcus Ellison remained bound, his calm posture unchanged. His eyes tracked every movement, noting each detail as Victoria and the captain disappeared into the jetway under federal escort. Jake stood frozen in the aisle, pale and silent. Reed turned toward Marcus, his voice lowering just enough to be heard. "We'll take care of those," he said, nodding toward the zip ties. An agent stepped forward, producing a utility cutter. With one clean motion, the plastic restraint snapped. Marcus flexed his wrists slowly, the deep red indentation stark against his dark skin. The passengers around him watched, the weight of what they had witnessed settling in. The network was bigger than they'd realized, and this was just the beginning. The day after Flight 217's emergency interception at Hollow Creek, headlines erupted like wildfire. North Star Airways under federal investigation. CEO restrained midair. FBI confirms ongoing probe. Photos of Victoria Hale being escorted in cuffs flanked every news feed. But the headlines were just the surface. Inside a secured conference room at the Valenport Federal Bureau office, Marcus Ellison sat at the head of a long table. The bruising on his wrists was still visible, faint red ridges that served as an unspoken reminder of the flight. Ryan Cole sat 2 seats down, a folder of printed logs in front of him. At the far end, Agent Mason Reed and Ethan Ward reviewed the evidence streaming across a wall of monitors. Ryan slid a hard drive across the table toward Reed. "This is everything I could capture from the in-flight network before the diversion. Passenger risk flagging, blocked transmissions, and most importantly, navigation override logs." Reed connected the drive to the secure system. Lines of code began scrolling. Ethan leaned forward, tapping his finger lightly against the desk. The diversion wasn't about safety. It was about proximity. Hollow Creek isn't equipped for full commercial offload, but it is isolated enough for an unmarked transfer. Marcus spoke for the first time, his voice even but carrying weight. And Victoria Hale wasn't working alone. You saw the captain's reaction. Reed's eyes stayed on the screen. We've confirmed the incentive credit in Captain Harris's ledger. That wasn't a company bonus. It was an off-record payment. Ryan exhaled quietly. The part that worries me is where it came from. On the screen, the decrypted data from Marcus's watch began populating a diagram. Ethan stood, walking to the display as a massive network map emerged. At the center, North Star Airways internal systems, branching outward. Hundreds of nodes representing connected flights, routes, and data capture points. At the top of the diagram, a bold label appeared. Operation SkyHarvest. Ryan leaned forward. This isn't just random snooping. This is structured, coordinated. Reed studied the lines of connection. How far does it go? Ethan tapped another key. The map zoomed out. The scope widened, revealing interlinked servers and overlapping routes that stretched beyond North Star's network. Ryan's eyes widened. Those aren't North Star codes. Ethan's voice was quiet, but sharp. No, they're not. Reed stepped closer. Which airline is that? The monitor highlighted the secondary network in a different color. It pulsed faintly. At the bottom corner, a logo emerged. Subtle, corporate, unmistakable. Skylinks International. Marcus's jaw tightened. Skylinks was one of the largest global carriers, with operations in over 50 countries. Their name being attached to SkyHarvest shifted the investigation from a single company scandal to an industry-level conspiracy. Ryan broke the silence. If Skylinks is tied in, this isn't just about North Star. This is a coordinated data-sharing alliance. Ethan's eyes swept the map. Not sharing, selling. Reed turned sharply. You're saying they've been harvesting passenger data across multiple carriers, then selling it? Marcus's gaze was steady. Not just selling, leveraging. Political routes, corporate negotiations, trade deals. Every high-value passenger becomes a product. Every flight, an opportunity. Reed's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then put it on speaker. A federal analyst's voice came through, urgent. Agent Reed, we've just traced the offshore proxy handling North Star's outbound data. It's routed through a Skylinks-operated server farm in Kerwin Valley. Multiple shell companies are involved. We're cross-referencing transactions now. Reed exchanged a glance with Ethan. Keep digging, he said, ending the call. Ryan shifted uneasily in his chair. If two major carriers are involved, what are the odds there are more? Ethan looked at Marcus. Marcus's expression didn't change. High. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the revelation settling on everyone. This wasn't a contained scandal. It was systemic. Reed broke the silence. If we take this public now, we risk spooking the others. They'll shut down servers, scrub evidence, go dark before we can act. Ethan nodded slowly. But if we wait too long, the data pipeline keeps running. Ryan gestured toward the network diagram. SkyHarvest is still live. Every day we hesitate, more passenger data is siphoned out. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice low but cutting through the tension. Then we don't wait. We pressure the weakest link first. North Star is already exposed. Skylinks will scramble to distance themselves. That's when we catch them. Reed's mouth curved into the faintest ghost of a smile. You're suggesting we use the scandal as bait? Marcus didn't answer directly, but his silence was telling. Ethan walked back to the table. We can initiate controlled leaks, enough to trigger market pressure without tipping off the entire network. Ryan added. And while they're scrambling, we map the rest of the connections. If there are more airlines, we'll see them. Reed looked at Marcus. This isn't just going to take down one airline. This could shake the entire industry. Marcus's eyes met his. Then maybe it's time it was shaken. The room was quiet again, but it wasn't the quiet of hesitation. It was the quiet before action. On the monitor, the SkyHarvest diagram continued to pulse. 2 airlines exposed, more shadows on the horizon. For the passengers of Flight 217, the ordeal had ended on the tarmac at Hollow Creek. But for Marcus Ellison, Ryan Cole, Ethan Ward, and Mason Reed, it was just beginning. The morning after the Hollow Creek interception, Marcus Ellison woke to a city saturated in headlines. Not of victory, but of controversy. North Star CEO restraint sparks. Debate, overreaction, or justice? Sources claim Ellison staged flight incident to pressure airlines. Public opinion split, whistleblower or opportunist. Marcus stood at the wide windows of his temporary suite in Valenport, the skyline lit by a pale sunrise. Ethan Ward stood a few feet away, tablet in hand, scrolling through the latest media coverage. The tone had shifted overnight. "They're hitting every channel," Ethan said grimly. "Talk shows, opinion pieces, even so-called neutral networks. They're painting you as a man with an agenda." Marcus's voice was even. "I do have an agenda." Ethan looked up. "You know what I mean." On one screen, a political commentator spoke in measured tones. "Let's be clear, Marcus Ellison is no stranger to controversy. Orion's Shield has profited immensely from airline security contracts. It's not unreasonable to suspect he's leveraging this incident for corporate gain." Another network cut to a panel debate. A former airline executive spoke heatedly. "He's using this to tank North Star's value and secure market space for his own ventures. This isn't justice, it's strategy." Ryan Cole sat at the far end of the suite, reviewing the SkyHarvest logs again. His jaw tightened. "They're trying to turn this into a story about you instead of the system." Marcus didn't move from the window. "That's exactly what I expected them to do." Ethan's phone buzzed. He checked it, then exhaled sharply. "It's worse. Someone's pushing the narrative hard. We just traced multiple PR buys linked to shell entities, one of them tied to Skylinks." Ryan looked up from his work. "So they're playing offense." Marcus turned from the window finally, his expression as controlled as ever. "Then it's time to let them," Ethan frowned. "Meaning?" "Let them overreach," Marcus said simply. "Truth doesn't have to shout. It just has to be timed." The suite fell silent for a moment, the low hum of the city outside the only sound. By midday, the coverage had intensified. Street interviews showed citizens divided. Some questioned why Marcus had been flying on North Star at all, given Orion Shield's competing contracts. Others insisted he had orchestrated the entire scene to gain leverage over the industry. In the federal building across town, Mason Reed sat in a secure room reviewing the growing pile of evidence. His phone buzzed. A message from an anonymous source flashed across the screen. "You want proof? Check the cabin feed." Reed's eyes narrowed. He tapped the encrypted link. A video file began to play. Grainy, but clear enough. The forward cabin security camera from Flight 217. It showed Victoria Hale approaching Marcus in 2A. Her posture was stiff, her expression cold. There was no provocation, no disturbance. Just her producing the zip ties and binding his wrists as nearby passengers looked on in shock. Reed watched the clip twice, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just testimony or circumstantial evidence. This was visual, irrefutable. He picked up his phone, dialing Ethan. "Ward," Reed said without preamble. "How fast can you get to the bureau?" "Fast enough," Ethan replied cautiously. "Why?" "We just got the hammer," Reed said, "and I'm going to drop it at the right moment." In the suite, Ethan disconnected the call and looked at Marcus. "Reed has something. He's not saying what, but he sounded confident." Marcus's expression didn't change, but there was a faint glint in his eyes. "Then the timing is almost right." By early evening, the pressure was at its peak. A prominent investigative show aired a special segment questioning Marcus's credibility. They replayed select clips from passenger cell phones, carefully edited to suggest ambiguity about his behavior. Ethan muted the television. "They're stacking the deck. By morning, the narrative will be set in stone unless..." The secure phone on the table buzzed. Ethan answered. Reed's voice came through, calm but charged. "It's time," Reed said. "Send your press contact to the Bureau. We're releasing the footage." An hour later, a press conference was called at the Valenport Bureau headquarters. Reporters crowded the lobby, cameras flashing, the air electric with anticipation. Reed stepped to the podium, his suit crisp, his expression steady. "Good evening. I'll be brief." Behind him, a screen lit up. The forward cabin feed began to play. The room went silent. There was Marcus Ellison, seated calmly in 2A. Victoria Hale approached, zip ties in hand, her face impassive. There was no verbal warning, no indication of disturbance. She bound his wrists, her movements practiced and firm. Reed's voice cut through the silence. "This is unedited security footage from Flight 217. It confirms Mr. Ellison was restrained without cause, in violation of federal aviation protocols." The footage played again, this time slowed, zoomed. Gasps rippled through the room. Reed stepped back from the podium. "We will continue our investigation into all individuals and entities involved in this incident, including possible systemic misconduct within the airline industry." Questions erupted, but Reed left without taking them. Within an hour, the clip was everywhere. On social media, the reaction was immediate. Hashtags flipped from skepticism to outrage. "Hatched Ellison vindicated" trended worldwide. He was tied up for no reason? This is worse than we thought. The FBI better tear them apart. I owe Marcus Ellison an apology. In the suite, Ryan scrolled through the flood of reactions. They just torched their own PR campaign. Ethan looked at Marcus. "Your approval rating just reversed in under an hour." Marcus sat calmly, his gaze on the city lights beyond the window. "It's not about approval, it's about leverage. And now we have more than we did this morning." Ethan's phone buzzed again. Another message from Reed. "Skylinks is already issuing a statement. They're denying involvement. It's exactly what we wanted." Marcus turned back from the window, his voice measured. "Then it's time to push them harder." The backlash from the released cabin footage had spread far beyond North Star Airways. Public anger wasn't just directed at a single airline. It was directed at an entire industry. Passenger advocacy groups flooded social media. Consumer protection lawyers announced class action suits. Politicians who had been quiet suddenly became very vocal, calling for hearings and oversight. Inside the Valenport Bureau, Marcus Ellison, Ethan Ward, and Agent Mason Reed sat in a secure conference room, the table between them covered in documents. The walls displayed evidence boards linking North Star, Skylinks, and the sprawling SkyHarvest network. Reed leaned forward, fingers interlaced. "The public is with us, but outrage is temporary. We need something that locks this down before the industry weathers the storm and slips back into business as usual." Ethan nodded, sliding a draft document across the table toward Marcus. "That's why we're proposing this." Marcus read the header, Flight Data Integrity Act. Ethan's voice was steady as he explained. "The act criminalizes unauthorized collection, storage, or sale of passenger data by any airline or affiliated service provider. It mandates encryption standards for all in-flight networks, third-party audits of airline IT systems, and heavy penalties, including operational license suspension for violations." Reed's expression was measured. "You're asking for the kind of regulation that will make you enemies in every boardroom from here to Geneva." Marcus looked up from the document, his tone calm. "If that's the price of protecting people who can't protect themselves at 30,000 feet, then it's worth paying." Ethan added, "We've already lined up congressional allies. After the footage release, no one wants to be seen as defending the airlines." Reed tapped the table. "Good, but understand this. If you go forward, they'll come for you harder than before. They'll dig, they'll smear, they'll try to make you the villain again." Marcus's voice was firm. "Let them." Over the next week, the proposal moved fast, faster than anyone thought possible. The combination of public pressure, clear evidence, and Marcus's high-profile testimony made it nearly impossible for lawmakers to stall. Marcus stood before a packed Senate committee, the Flight Data Integrity Act projected on the screen behind him. His voice was measured but carried the weight of someone who had lived the consequences. "This is not about one flight or one passenger," Marcus began. "This is about the unchecked power of corporations to turn passengers into products without their knowledge or consent. It's about restoring trust in the skies. If we can't guarantee privacy in transit, then the air itself becomes hostile territory." Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked. Public support grew stronger with every appearance. But behind the scenes, the pushback was growing just as fast. Lobbyists swarmed offices. Airline CEOs warned of financial collapse. Analysts predicted ticket prices would skyrocket. In a secure holding facility, Victoria Hale sat in an interrogation room, her once immaculate uniform replaced by standard detention attire. Mason Reed entered, closing the door behind him. "You've been cooperative so far," Reed said evenly. "But we need more. You weren't acting alone, we know that. You've already seen what happens when your co-conspirators start falling one by one." Victoria's face was pale, but her voice was steady. "You think taking me down will stop this? You're just cutting strings while the puppeteer stands in the dark." Reed leaned forward. "Then show me the puppeteer." Victoria hesitated, her eyes scanning the room as if weighing her choices. Then she spoke quietly, almost like she was afraid to say the name aloud. "There's someone above Skylinks, above North Star. We called him the Broker." Reed's brow furrowed. "Name?" Victoria shook her head. "I don't know his real one. Nobody does. But I know where his orders come from. Kerwin Valley. Same place as the Skylink server farm." Reed's jaw tightened. "You're telling me this whole operation was run by an unknown entity who uses multinational airlines as collection nodes?" Victoria's voice dropped lower. "Not just airlines. Airports, booking agencies, private charter firms. The airlines are just the cover. He's building something bigger than SkyHarvest." Reed left the room without another word, his mind already moving 3 steps ahead. Back in the bureau conference room, Reed relayed the intel to Marcus and Ethan. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "The Broker." Ethan tapped the name into his encrypted tablet, pulling up fragments of classified reports. "There are whispers of someone matching that description, always in the background of major corporate espionage cases, always untouchable." Reed's tone was grim. "If he exists, he's the real enemy. SkyHarvest is just the visible arm." Marcus looked at the Flight Data Integrity Act draft still on the table. "Then the act is step 1. The Broker is step 2. 2 days later, the Senate committee passed the act by a near unanimous vote. The president signed it into law within the week. Headlines exploded again, but this time in celebration. Flight Data Integrity Act passed. New era of passenger privacy. At the signing ceremony, Marcus stood to the side, declining the spotlight. His speech was short, pointed. "They tied my hands at 30,000 feet. Today, we untie the hands of every passenger who's ever flown." But as the applause filled the room, his thoughts weren't on the cameras or the victory. They were on Kerwin Valley, on a shadow figure called the Broker, and on the knowledge that the fight had only shifted to a new battlefield. The air at Valenport International was crisp and cool, sunlight spilling through the tall glass panes of the newly renovated Terminal B. A ribbon of travelers wound through the gates, their steps lighter, their conversations less guarded than they had been a year ago. In the center of the premium lounge area, a polished brass plaque caught the light. Ellison Suite. Marcus Ellison stood at the edge of the room as the plaque was unveiled, his tailored charcoal suit as understated as ever. Applause filled the lounge, but Marcus didn't step forward. This wasn't his moment, at least not in his eyes. Ethan Ward stood beside him, his tone low enough for only Marcus to hear. "They named an entire suite after you, Marcus. You could at least pretend to enjoy it." Marcus's lips curved in the faintest ghost of a smile. "It's not about my name. It's about what it means for the people using it." Inside the suite, Travelers settled into leather chairs. Business people opened laptops without worrying who might be watching their data. And families streamed movies on encrypted in-flight systems that had become mandatory after the Flight Data Integrity Act. Ethan gestured toward the room. This is change, you can see. A year ago, no one even knew what SkyHarvest was. Now, airlines are scrambling to prove how secure they are. That's because of you. Marcus's gaze stayed on the passengers. It's because the truth got out. That's bigger than me. From across the lounge, Ryan Cole approached, a tablet under his arm. He was out of his North Star uniform now, working as an independent aviation systems consultant. Security audits are coming in clean, he reported. For the first time in years, there's no sign of unauthorized modules on any domestic carrier. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Domestic carriers? That's a careful choice of words. Ryan hesitated just a fraction. International routes are trickier. We don't have the same oversight once they leave our airspace, but we're watching. Marcus nodded slowly. He knew better than to expect the fight to end completely. Laws could be passed, systems could be upgraded, but there would always be someone testing the edges of those protections. The ceremony concluded, applause echoing one last time before the crowd began to disperse. Marcus stepped away from the main floor, finding a quieter corner by the tall windows that overlooked the runway. Outside, a North Star jet rolled slowly toward takeoff. A year ago, the sight of that logo would have been a reminder of everything that went wrong. Now, it was a reminder of what had been forced to change. Footsteps approached. Marcus didn't turn. Mason Reed's reflection appeared in the glass beside him. The federal agent looked the same as ever. Dark suit, steady gaze, the kind of presence that didn't announce itself but was always felt. Busy day for you, Reed said quietly. I prefer busy years, Marcus replied. Reed reached into his coat, pulling out a thin, sealed folder. The cover was stamped classified in stark red. He held it out. This came in from Kerwin Valley. Marcus took the folder but didn't open it immediately. His eyes stayed on the plane outside. Victoria's testimony, Reed nodded. You remember the name she gave us? The broker. Marcus turned the folder over in his hands. Still in the wind? Reed's voice was calm, but there was a weight beneath it. More than that, he's moving. We intercepted chatter suggesting he shifted assets out of Kerwin Valley and into a new hub, one we can't trace yet. And he's still got people in place, not just in airlines. Marcus's gaze hardened slightly. Airports, booking, charters. Reed added, and maybe government liaisons. He's careful but not untouchable. Marcus opened the folder slowly. Inside were surveillance photos, grainy images of a man in a tailored overcoat, his face never fully visible. Financial ledgers were tucked behind them, with offshore accounts linking shell companies in 3 different countries. Ethan approached, having noticed the 2 men standing apart from the rest of the gathering. More ghosts? He asked dryly. Marcus closed the folder. One in particular. Reed's tone shifted slightly, just enough for Ethan to catch the undercurrent. This isn't over, Ward. The act was a victory, but it didn't end the network. It just exposed the first layer. Ethan looked at Marcus. You're not thinking of walking away from this, are you? Marcus glanced out the window again. A second plane lifted into the air, its wings flashing in the sunlight. When I was tied to that seat, I promised myself that if I got free, I'd make sure no one else would go through it. That hasn't changed. The 3 men stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the terminal muted behind the glass. Reed finally broke it. The broker's careful. You'll only get one chance to move on him. Marcus's voice was low, deliberate. Then I'll make it count. Outside, the plane climbed higher, banking into the open sky. In the lounge behind them, passengers enjoyed the peace of a safer system, unaware of the shadow still moving beneath the surface. Marcus turned away from the window at last, tucking the classified folder under his arm. His expression was calm, but his eyes were cold, focused. The applause, the plaque, the ceremony, they were just milestones. The real work was still ahead, and the next storm was already on the horizon.